The whole town turned out that morning. Hearne, Texas, 1980. On the south edge of town, where the highway ran flat toward the horizon, there was a ribbon and a pair of oversized scissors, and a crowd standing in the winter sun who had waited a long time for a store like this. You were glad it came. Everyone was glad it came. Nobody in that crowd knew they were watching the beginning of the end of their main street. This is a story about a promise, and the towns that believed it. The promise was simple, and it was true. Lower prices, more choices. Right here, no more driving an hour to the city for a winter coat or a set of tires. Thousands of small towns across America celebrated the day the discount store arrived, and they had every reason to. What almost none of them understood was the arithmetic underneath the ribbon. Nobody voted to hollow out the town square. Nobody stood up and said, "The drugstore and the 5 and dime and the hardware store should close." It happened anyway, quietly, store by store, over about 10 years. And then, in a few towns, something happened that not one person in that opening day crowd could have imagined. This is how it went. To understand the day it came, you have to understand the man who sent it. Sam Walton opened his first Walmart Discount City in Rogers, Arkansas on July 2nd, 1962. He had one idea that nobody else in retail took seriously. Everybody else built where the people already were. The big discount chains would not enter a market under 50,000 people. Walton went the other way. In his own memoir, years later, he described the plan as simply putting good-sized discount stores into little one-horse towns that everybody else was ignoring. And he was right, more right than even he had guessed. He wrote that the first big lesson was that there was much, much more business out there in small-town America than anybody, including him, had ever dreamed of. He clustered his stores within a day's drive of a warehouse and let word spread from one town to the next. So he barely had to advertise. The growth from there is hard to hold in your head. By 1967, he had 24 stores. By the end of January 1980, the year Hearne cut its ribbon, the company crossed $1 billion in annual sales. 7 years after that, on its 25th birthday, it ran nearly 1,200 stores and employed 200,000 people. By 1990, it had almost 2,000 stores and clubs and had become the number 1 retailer in the nation. By the turn of the century, it was pushing 4,000 stores and $165 billion a year. So the store coming to your town was not a fluke, and it was not a favor. It was the leading edge of the most successful retail machine the country had ever built, and it was aimed directly at Main Street. Put yourself in that town before the store came. If you needed something the local shops did not carry, you drove. An hour there, an hour back, a tank of gas, a whole Saturday gone. The selection downtown was thin because a small merchant could only stock so much. A hardware store had one brand of paint, maybe two. The dress shop had what the owner had guessed you might want 6 months earlier when she placed the order. Prices were higher because a single store buying a few dozen of a thing could never match what a national chain paid buying a few million. So when the discount store announced it was coming, the town saw a gift. Cheaper school clothes for a family with 4 kids. A real pharmacy with a full shelf of everything. Tires and toys under one roof. And the money staying closer to home instead of driving off to the county seat. For a town that had watched its young people leave, and its downtown go a little quieter every year. A company this big choosing to build here felt like a vote of confidence. It felt like being picked. The jobs were real, too. When the store opened in Hearne, it employed about 90 people and paid roughly $1 million a year in wages into a town of a few thousand. It paid taxes. In Hearne, the store's tax contribution came to $250,000 of the town's $5.4 million budget. That is not a small number for a small town. So the celebration was not naive. The people cheering had done the math on their own kitchen tables, and for them, on that day, the math worked. Here is what the kitchen table math could not see. Every dollar that walked into the new store on the edge of town was a dealer that used to walk into a store downtown. And the shift did not announce itself. Nobody stopped shopping downtown all at once. You still went in for the things you had always gone in for. You only went a little less often, and so did everyone else. And a small store living on thin margins does not need its town to leave. It only needs its town to come in a little less often. Go back to Hearne. When the Washington Post came to write about the town 10 years later, it found the pattern already complete. The merchants downtown had folded because they could not compete. The paper named the ones still standing and how they had survived. C.N. Lockhart had run a furniture store in Hearne for about 30 years. Small appliances had been the backbone of his business, and he stopped selling them entirely because the store on the edge of town could undersell him on everyone. He survived only by retreating to the large appliances Walmart did not carry. Down the street, Joe Wilson had run the Rexall drugstore for about 40 years. His over-the-counter sales collapsed after the store arrived. He cut his prices 20% and kept his pharmacy open at night and on holidays, hours when the discount store's pharmacy was closed, and that is how he hung on. Two men who adapted by surrendering every single thing the new store also sold. That was what winning looked like downtown. You kept your store by giving up most of what was in it. Those were the survivors. The ones who did not adapt left no interview behind, only an empty storefront, and Hearne was not unusual. We know that because a man in Iowa counted. His name was Kenneth Stone, an economist at Iowa State University, and in 1988 he did something nobody had done. He measured it. He pulled the state's retail sales tax records, town by town, for the years before a Walmart arrived and the years after, and he watched where the money went. His first findings raised the ire of Sam Walton himself and the company's top officials. They did not like being counted. What Stone found in the towns that did not get a Walmart, the smaller towns nearby that now had to compete with one, was a slow bleeding out over the 10 years from 1983 to 1996. He tracked how far retail sales fell, and the smaller the town, the harder it fell. Towns between 2,500 and 5,000 people lost about 17% of their retail sales. Towns between 1,000 and 2,500 lost about 29%. Towns under 1,000 lost close to half of everything they sold. Out in the truly rural areas, the drop reached past 60%. Taken altogether, the towns competing against a Walmart and not getting one saw their retail economy shrink by about a third. And it was not random which stores died. Stone found the same casualties in town after town: the drugstore, the hardware store, the five and dime, the clothing store, the fabric shop, the sporting goods store. The stores that carried what Walmart carried were the ones that bled. He measured it category by category. In the towns competing against a Walmart, stores selling home furniture, appliances, and draperies could lose almost a third of their sales in a single year. Building supply dealers lost up to a quarter. Clothing stores lost about 17% even in the towns that got the Walmart, and close to 28% in the towns nearby that only had to compete with it. These were exactly the merchants who had lined up to cut the ribbon. Stone put it plainly years later. The gains, he said, mostly came from Walmart itself, and it had negative impacts on a lot of other businesses in town, mainly any store that was selling essentially the same thing they were selling. Back in 1989, he had said it harder. Go into towns in Illinois where Walmart had been for 8 or 10 years, he told the New York Times Magazine, and the downtowns were just ghost towns. The Times profiled one Iowa town that year, Independence, where by 1989, about a dozen downtown businesses, some of them more than 100 years old, had folded after the store came. The logic underneath it was brutal and simple. A new store might do millions of dollars in its first year in a town that size, and that money did not appear from nowhere. It came straight out of the cash registers of the merchants already there. 100 years of doing business, undone in less than 10. That was the promise, delivered. Lower prices did arrive. So did the empty windows on the square. Now, here is the part of the story that the opening day crowds could never have pictured, because it broke the one thing everybody assumed. Everybody assumed that whatever else happened, the store would stay. Go to Nowata, Oklahoma. Sam Walton himself opened a store there in 1982, in a struggling little city sitting on aged oil fields, just as sinking world oil prices were knocking the profit out of the wells. The town had about 3,900 people. The store did what these stores did. According to the Tampa Bay Times, it became the biggest business in town and its second largest employer, with a payroll of 70 people, behind only the nursing home. The small merchants downtown thinned out the same way they had everywhere else, and then, in 1994, the company closed the store. The town had done nothing wrong. Walmart's growth plans simply no longer had a place for the small stores it had built in the early 80s. It was moving to giant supercenters that needed a whole region to feed them, and the little towns did not fit the new map. So Nowata lost twice. It had already lost most of its main street to the store over those 12 years. The old shops that might have carried the town through a downturn were gone, and the empty buildings did not fill back in. Now it lost the store too, and there was nothing left to go back to. 12 years is long enough for a town to lose the habit of its own square, and habits like that do not come back on their own. The downtown could not simply reopen. Those merchants had retired or died, their fixtures sold off years before, and a closed store does not reverse a closed store. According to the Tampa Bay Times, the sales tax that Walmart had generated was worth enough that losing it drove the town's $1.2 million budget, $80,000, into the red. The town cut services and raised taxes, and its people got back in the car and drove the highways for clothing and household goods, back to exactly the errand the store was supposed to have ended. A local business leader put the whole arc into one sentence, quoted in that same paper. They came in and ravaged all the small businesses. And when it came to the point where they were not satisfied, they left. Nowata was not alone in this either. In that same 1994 wave, 3 more Oklahoma towns lost their early Walmart stores: Pawhuska, Bixby, and Jenks. The company called them consolidations rather than closures, but the word did not matter to the towns. The building in Pawhuska sat empty long enough that people were still photographing the old Walmart sign years later. And back in Hearne, the same thing had already happened 4 years earlier than Nowata. The store that opened to a cheering crowd in 1980 closed on New Year's Eve of 1990, exactly 10 years after it came. The company's reason was flat. It had not turned a profit the whole time it was there. At the time, that made Hearne a rarity. Of more than 1,500 Walmart stores then open in the country, it was one of only 6 that had ever closed. The town got the wreckage of a chain store and none of the permanence. The old Walmart building in Hearne is a high school now. It would be easy to end there and call Walmart the villain. It wouldn't be true. Nobody was forced to shop at the new store. The people who cut the ribbon shopped there, and so did their neighbors, and they did it because it genuinely saved them money. And the picture was never all loss, even in Stone's own numbers. When he went back 25 years later and looked again, he found that the larger host towns, the ones between 3,000 and 20,000 people that actually got the store, often saw their total retail sales rise over the long run, and specialty shops that did not sell what Walmart sold could do just fine. It was the smallest towns, the ones under 2,500 that never got a store of their own, that kept losing about 30% of their retail over the years. The damage was real, but so was the benefit, and honesty means holding both, and the benefit was not small. Years later, 2 economists measured just how much. Studying the actual prices, they found that for identical food items, a Walmart supercenter ran roughly 15 to 25% cheaper than a traditional supermarket. They calculated that big box stores left the average household better off by an amount worth around $780 a year in food spending alone in 2003 dollars. And that saving fell most heavily where it helped most, in lower-income households that stretched every dollar. The savings were real, and for a working family, they mattered. The tragedy of these towns is not that anyone was cheated. It is that a million small, sensible choices, each one right on its own kitchen table, added up across a whole region to a result nobody chose and no single shopper could undo. The choice was real. So was the wreckage, which is why it matters that the pattern was not a law of nature. A few towns proved it could go another way. The clearest one is Viroqua, Wisconsin. When Walmart came there in 1987, people said exactly what you would expect. They feared it would be the final blow to a downtown that was already struggling. But Viroqua did not just brace for it and hope. The town enrolled in Wisconsin's Main Street program, raised money to fix up its downtown, went out and recruited new businesses, and helped the shops it already had. And according to the reporting at the time, including a later account from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, in the 3 years after the store arrived, the number of small businesses downtown actually went up. Smithsonian Magazine noticed, and in 1992 it called Viroqua the town that beat Walmart. But look closely. at why that story was worth a magazine headline. It was news precisely because it was rare. Viroqua did not survive by luck or by the store being kinder there. It survived because a whole town decided, together and on purpose, to protect the thing it was about to lose, and then did the unglamorous work for years. The other towns in this story loved their main streets no less. But loving something has never been enough to save it. You have to organize to save it, and most towns did not know, until the windows were already dark, that a fight was even available to them. So what was it really that those towns lost? Not the merchandise. You can still buy a coat and a set of tires, cheaper than ever, and the man who counted the damage in Iowa would be the first to tell you the prices were no illusion. What they lost is harder to put a number on. A downtown was never only a place to buy things. It was the place you ran into people. The druggist who knew which of your kids had the ear infections and who once opened up on a Sunday because a fever would not wait. The hardware man who talked you out of the wrong bolt and into the right one and did not charge you for the advice. The clerk at the 5 and dime who watched you grow up over a candy counter and still called you by your first name when you came back with children of your own. Those relationships were not sentimental extras on top of the shopping. They were the shopping. The errand was the excuse, and the people were the point. When those stores went, the town did not just lose its retail, it lost the reason to walk the same few blocks your neighbors were walking, at the same hour, on the same Saturday. A parking lot on the edge of town is a fine place to buy a coat. It is not a place you run into anyone. Nobody has ever bumped into an old friend in aisle 9 and stood there talking for 20 minutes. The store sold you everything the old square sold you, except the square itself, and the square was the part that could not be reordered from a warehouse. And in the towns Walmart later left, it did not even leave that. It left a slab of empty concrete where downtown used to be. And the memory of both? So I want to hear it from you. What happened when it came to your town? Did the downtown empty out, or did your town find a way to hold on? Did the store stay, or did it pack up and leave you with a parking lot? Tell me below. I read every single one.